For those who don't know, this is an adaptation of the first Dune prequel book written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson in 1999. I'm actually reading the full novel right now, and I have about 200 pages left, so look for a review of that soon, but obviously it takes about 10 minutes to read a comic, so I'm gonna start with this. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy with the Dune prequel books, with Dune fans, and I'm going to get more into how I feel about that when I review the full book, but I will say that this story lends itself more to a comic than, let's say, one of Frank Herbert's books in the Dune saga, because where his writing was more steeped in philosophy, this book takes a different approach and has more action and world building in it. Comics are a visual medium, so this works well. One of my main criticisms of this book is that some of the dialogue is overly spelled out for the reader, and I don't know if they thought the story would be too complicated for new readers to pick up on, but in some panels the characters are literally saying what they're thinking out loud, and I feel like these moments could have been done in a more subtle way. Again, I think the writers might have been nervous that this story would be hard for people new to the Dune universe to understand, so they over-explained some plot points to make it more accessible. Other than that, I did think the pacing of this book was well done, and they did a nice job balancing the three main storylines, starting with Baron on Arrakis, Pardet Kynes on Kytane, and Leto on Caladan. Most Dune fans have already seen Arrakis depicted a bunch of times with professional art or fan art, but it was really interesting to see the other planets fleshed out a bit more in this issue. Some of the character designs were surprising to me, especially the look they came up with for Emperor Elrond. He looks way more menacing than how I pictured him in the book, and that was a welcome surprise. I also thought the bullfighting scene with Duke Paulus on Caladan was pretty spot on from the way I envisioned it in the novel as well. I do wonder what most newcomers are going to think about this if they aren't familiar with the original Dune novels, because I feel like it helps to know at least the first book to understand this world a little better. The art by Dev Pramanik was pretty solid all the way through, and like I said, I did enjoy the design choices he made. I'm excited to see the planet Ix depicted in the next issue, and hopefully we get an introduction to a young Duncan Idaho on Giedi Prime, which is the homeworld of the Harkonnens. The quality of this book was also great, and there's an awesome cover done by Jay Lee. It looks like he did the cover for the next issue as well, so I'm looking forward to that. Even if I hated this book, it still would have been worth it to buy for the cover alone. I would definitely recommend this for Dune fans, even if you don't like the prequel material, because it is still interesting to see a lot of this stuff visualized for once. It's kind of funny because if you've seen my review on the full novel, you'll know that there were some elements that didn't work for me, and pretty much all of my problems with the book were in this second issue, but it actually works better in a comic this time around. Pardet Kynes arrives on Arrakis to study the planet and gets sent out with the Baron's nephew Rabban to hunt a worm. I had a problem with this in the book as a fan of the original, because I don't think Rabban or any of the Harkonnens should have been able to kill a worm so easily, because in the original book, they're these larger-than-life creatures that seem like they are immortal and dangerous. But I have to admit that this whole sequence works well in a comic book because it's pretty intense. It also made me think a little bit more about the reason for this sequence. It might have been so Pardet could study the decomposition of the worm as soon as it gets blown up by Rabban and gets him started as the new planetologist of Arrakis in a more exciting way. The book goes really in depth with his studies of the planet, and I found myself sort of checking out during those parts, but I'm interested to see how they tackle that in the comic, and so far they're off to a good start. This issue also has the debut of a young Duncan Idaho. This was one of the stories I was interested to see the most, and it didn't disappoint. I liked the way Giedi Prime was portrayed, and Duncan looked pretty much how I pictured him in the book. This is a good setup of his character for readers new to the Dune universe, and it shows how brutal the Harkonnens are, because not only do they hunt people for sport, but Rabban murders Duncan's parents in cold blood, starting Duncan's lifelong hatred for them. Something that I would have liked to have seen in the book and the comic was the development of his parents a little more, so that their death stings and we can root for Duncan to have his revenge. but they get right to the point and waste no time, not only in the book, but here as well. I'd like to hear the author's reasoning for that because I feel like it would have made more of an impact to flesh them out and make them likable before their senseless deaths. The art by Dev Promnik continues to be solid. I like that it's just cartoony enough, but not in a silly way, because Dune is more of an adult book than something like Star Wars, and the art needs to reflect that. It was good to see another great cover by Jay Lee, and the overall quality of these comics are great. We also get to see the Bene Gesserit sisterhood on Wallach 9, which is also really in line with how I pictured it in the book. I've always found it fascinating that different people can both read words with no pictures and imagine the same type of design. We're introduced to one of the main sisters in this book named Anirul, and they decide that Helen Mahim and the Baron must breed to start the process of creating the Kwisatz Haderach, which is a supreme being that the Bene Gesserit have been selectively breeding for years. It's an interesting concept, and I love the design of the Bene Gesserit sisters in this comic. Finally, we get to see young Duke Leto's journey to Ix, which was pretty cool as well. It was nice to see the Guild Highliners and get a sense of how people travel in the Dune universe. This issue ends on a cliffhanger, which was funny because I know what happens, but I keep forgetting that doing stuff like that works better in this medium. I'm excited to see the more underground tech-based planet of Ix in the next issue. And overall, this was another solid entry in this 12-issue series. So far, it's following the book pretty close, and I'm looking forward to more. I definitely still recommend this series to Dune fans and fans of sci-fi that are looking to get into something like Dune. This story is a little more streamlined and easy to understand compared to the original books, and takes place before them, so you don't need to know anything going in. Even though I do admit it's fun if you've read the original series to see what these characters were up to years before. So we're now at the part where things start ramping up a little bit in the book, and it was very well represented here as well. First of all, I feel like the art has significantly improved from issue 1, and it looks great on this Comixology app. There's some really great line work, and I love the coloring for this series. The backgrounds were also really well done, especially on the Gidi Prime sections of this issue. For example, I really dug the way the trees look in the background, and that might be a small thing to pick out, but it really helps this comic to immerse you in the story and the world. The 5 separate stories are balanced out really well in this issue, and we start off with the Bene Gesserit sisterhood touching down on Gidi Prime to meet with the Baron Harkonnen. Like I said in previous reviews, they need the Baron to give the sisterhood a child for their own nefarious reasons, and they pretty much blackmail him because they know the Harkonnens have illegal supplies of the spice melange. This is a solid section showing how formidable the sisterhood can be, and I continue to love the costume design they use here. Elsewhere on Gidi Prime is the Baron's nephew, Raban, on a hunt, and the prey is young Duncan Idaho, armed with only a light and a knife. The art flows so well here, and the pacing does justice to this part of the book, where Duncan has to outsmart the Harkonnen hunters. The next part of this issue, with Leto arriving on Ix, was my most anticipated part, because I really wanted to see how the underworld of this planet was represented, and it really looked great. Prince Romber of House Vernius is the perfect character to introduce Leto to this new world and give us some exposition. I loved seeing the new guild highliners being constructed and even folding space in this issue. There's a minor scene with Shaddam and Fenring on Kytane that is very important to the overall endgame of this series, which is overthrowing Shaddam's father and trying to find a substitute for the spice. Even though I like how the art seems to be improving from issue to issue, I feel like more could have been done to separate some characters from each other, like the Baron and Shaddam, for example. They both have red hair and look very similar, and I feel like this might be confusing for people new to this story, since they're bouncing around between a ton of characters, even 3 issues in. Another gripe I have with this series is when the characters are saying what they're thinking out loud in the word balloons, when it could have been done like it's presented on this panel, for example, throughout, instead of going back and forth, because in this instance, Pardet is talking to himself when he could just be narrating and making more space for the artwork. Other than that, I'm surprised with how much I'm enjoying the Pardet scenes, because to me they were the most boring parts in the novel version, and I think it's done so much better in comic book form. I also really enjoyed the art in this battle scene between the Harkonnens and the Fremen, which is set up for Pardet to get to know them better. So yeah, this was by far my favorite issue, and this is a 12-issue series altogether, which is great because we'll get a nice full adaptation where they probably won't have to cut out much. It's getting harder to review because it continues to be really well done, but one of the things I kind of complained about in the issue 3 review is in full force right away in this issue, because Raban is looking exactly like the Baron, and it's getting even confusing to me because on the first page I see him hunting Duncan in the woods, and I was like, wait, I didn't know the Baron was there at this part, and then I realized it wasn't him. I just wish something was done with the character design to make Raban look a little different. Maybe if they made him bald or gave him some sort of different hairstyle. But it does bug me a little bit, even though I'm aware this is a total nitpick. The same also goes for Shaddam. I wish they did something slightly different with him as well, because that's 3 characters with the same red hair and a pretty similar face. And like I said in previous reviews, I can see this being a little confusing for new readers especially. Other than that, the pacing gets better and better with each issue, and I previously said that issue 3 had the best artwork, and I'm happy to say that the quality didn't drop at all with this one. I was interested to see what they were going to do with Helen and Baron having to procreate, and even though it's a completely uncomfortable scene, I'm glad that everyone involved in this comic are not dumbing down the material and being faithful to the book. They even added the part with Piter, which makes it even creepier. The stuff on the planet Ix continues to be my favorite. I love the design of the underground city, and the panel layout with Leto training is really dynamic and fun. The Pardet Kind section continues to surprise me with how much I'm enjoying it, because I remember kind of losing interest in the novel version, but the coloring is gorgeous, and the Fremen are one of my favorite groups in the original Dune series, so it's great to see them in comic book form. The only thing I don't really love is the design for Pardet's ground car in this. I wish it looked more retro sci-fi and less like a Batmobile, but again, this is a minor nitpick. There are only a couple pages dedicated to Shaddam and Fenring, and it's basically just them talking about waiting for Emperor Elrond to die so they can take over, and that's about it. Oh, and also the new Ixian highliners. Duncan gets rescued, sort of, by a lady named Janus, and this is the part that reminded me the most of Star Wars, and it did in the book as well, because they go to a spaceport to get Duncan off of the planet and to Caladan. I can't wait to see Duncan interact with Duke Paulus and eventually Leto as well, because this is the beginning of the House Atreides that we know in the original Dune, which is awesome. So yeah, this is obviously another recommend from me. There are little things that only slightly bug me, but it's really not a big deal. I really have to give credit to Comixology because the quality is just so good, and I've said it in a couple of my previous reviews, but it really is true, and that is the fact that the art by Dev Pramanik continues to get better and better with each issue. The level of detail put into this is fantastic, and it continues to make me enjoy one of my least favorite storylines in the book, which is the Pardet Kynes on Arrakis parts. But it's so much better to have the story visualized here. For example, I liked seeing the inside of the Fremen's siege. I really loved the design and the big stone-like table. Also, their still suits look amazing. It was also interesting to see the construction of the still suits in this issue. As a Dune fan, it's nice to see a little bit of the process involved with making them. This issue focuses heavily on Pardet continuing his mission to improve the ecology of Arrakis, and the planet looks really beautiful in this issue. Things really ramp up on Ix as well because we finally get the Suboids revolting with the help of the Tleilaxu, and there's a great feeling of dread right before this takes place, and some great acting in the artwork. There's a lot of cross-hatching used for the close-up shots of the characters, and you can really see the amount of time and effort put into making this book look great. Things also get more interesting on Kaitain because we finally get to see what the Tleilaxu look like, and this sets up a really important plot point for the story because the Emperor's told about the idea of making a synthesized version of the spice melange for House Carino, and if they use that, Arrakis would become obsolete in the process. Like I said, it was cool to see the Tleilaxu because I don't think they've ever been officially visualized in anything other than fan artwork, so it was cool to see their depiction of the Tleilaxu. We get a nice introduction to a soup doctor as well, and the one thing I'll say is the diamond tattoo on his head looked too much like an actual diamond stuck to his head instead of a smaller black ink diamond, which is usually how it's depicted in other media, but that's not that big of a deal. I laughed when Shaddam yells for more spice beer because that's what's slowly killing his father, and you see just how despicable and desperate he is for power, so that was also a nice touch. Pardet pretty much gets the Fremen's full attention and cooperation after one of them tries to kill him and ends up killing himself out of shame. The other Fremen see this as a sign and vow to help Kynes with his mission to eventually make it rain on Arrakis, among other things, which excites the tribe. The Suboid Revolt is pretty much exactly how I pictured it in the book, especially with Romber and Leto escaping, and it was a really exciting section of this book. The pacing is still fantastic, and a lot of credit goes to Kevin J. Anderson for the solid scripts. Things calm down with Duncan Idaho arriving on Caladan to find Duke Paulus Atreides and begin his new life, and it was a perfect way to end the issue on a high note. It doesn't waste any time getting into the revolt on Ix, and it's also really fast-paced because we're jumping from Ix to Kaitain every couple of pages, and this is another advantage of telling this story in comic book form because it was really effective to see the carnage unfold and then cut to Emperor Elrond scheming and hearing news of what is going down as it's happening. It also shows the complex nature of the story because you have Elrond being pretty despicable, and at the same time, the reason he's ill is because his own son has his own plans to dethrone him by slowly poisoning him, and it all works really well. I felt really bad for House Vernius because they have to make a really difficult decision to split up because they'll be harder to track down. And just like in the book, Romber and Kylea are sent to Caladan with Leto because they'll be safe under House Atreides. The acting continues to be really well done, especially in these heartbreaking moments, and I really like the backgrounds in this book a lot. There's always something unique and interesting to look at, even something as simple as the trippy blue lighting in a ship that makes the book really pop. This continues in the Bene Gesserit section of this book, and this might be my favorite page in the whole thing because it captures them so perfectly, and it looks incredibly ominous. Helen Mahim gives birth to her child, and they test it to see if maybe this could be the grandmother of the Kwisatz Haderach. And it isn't, which means she'll have to go back to the Baron and demand another child from him. This is such an unforgiving part of the novel, and it shows how detached the Bene Gesserit are from humanity and the lengths they will go to see their plans come to fruition. This issue is also interesting because we're introduced to Kaiter Pilru, who hasn't been in the comic yet, but this was the perfect time to introduce him because he becomes a more important character in the next book, and I almost forgot about his role in this because this comic has been focusing on the main characters up until this point, but I wonder if they'll get into his brother a little bit as well, because there are a couple sections in the book with them before the revolt on Ix, and his brother left to become a guild navigator. So we'll see how that plays out in the comic version with 6 issues left. I also really love the way the Sardaukar look in this. The Sardaukar are the Emperor's soldiers, and they're seen as the most elite fighters in the universe in the first Dune novel. And they almost look like medieval knights here, so it was definitely cool to see a little glimpse of them, and I'm happy with the way they're depicted so far in this. So now we're finally getting back to Caladan, and I just really love the way this book looks. I can't say enough good things about the art. You really get a sense that this is a sweeping epic, and you feel like you're going on an adventure every issue. There are also two smaller sections to cap off this issue. The first one is on Arrakis with Janice and Raban, and I won't show you what happens, but it's pretty brutal. And then it ends with a more streamlined version of Duncan Idaho working his way over to Castle Caladan, and I'm really excited to see Duncan meet Leto for the first time, because then you'll have these two legendary characters from the first novel getting to know each other, and it's always interesting to read that, so I'm looking forward to more of that from this series. This one is definitely a little slower because we just got over the crazy revolt on Ix last issue. So it begins with Pardet Kynes getting married and really being integrated with the Fremen tribe. So he has an even better advantage studying the planet of Arrakis, and it was interesting to see the Fremen rituals portrayed in a comic book. I really would have liked to see Dev Promenade take a shot at the adaptation of the original Dune novel, because I like his art way better than the team that did the Dune graphic novel that came out in November. And his art in the Arrakis sections are really nice looking, and he really does a nice job making the desert look mysterious, and it has a great sense of scope. This issue might be a little controversial for people that haven't read the book that this series is based on, because it has a pretty horrifying scene in it. I'll just say it's the part where the Baron gets his revenge on Helen Mahim and takes advantage of her when she shows up on Giedi Prime to have the Baron impregnate her for a second time. As brutal of a situation as it is, I thought the creative team did a good job subduing it just enough so it wasn't graphic and off-putting for new readers. As horrible as it is, I'm glad they decided to keep it in this comic adaptation because they're really staying true to the source material and not watering anything down, so I do appreciate that. It does help to show how evil and despicable the Baron is, but I go back and forth on what Helen is capable of doing. So what happens is Helen is able to unleash a chemical in her body that will infect the Baron and turn him into the overweight and grotesque villain that we know from the original novel. And I do kind of feel like the prequel books turn the Bene Gesserit sisters into almost godlike beings who could do anything, and it does get a little over the top for me in some situations like this. I really enjoy seeing Caladan the most because I always liked envisioning that planet whenever I was reading a Dune novel because it's the polar opposite of something like Arrakis, and they really nail the look in this issue. I enjoyed the Duncan Idaho parts of this book because he really makes an impression on Duke Paulus, and it shows how loyal he is and always will be to the Atreides that really stems from his hatred of the Harkonnens. It was also nice to see Thufir Hawat in this. He looks really cool, and he's training Romber and Leto. This issue also sets the stage for a rift between Leto's parents because his mother does not accept House Vernius as much as Duke Paulus does. I guess you could say it develops the relationship between Leto and Romber, but I did feel that their boat trip was kind of pointless, and I felt that way reading the novel as well. It was just a little side quest that doesn't have to do with the overall story, and although I like the scenery because it's something very different for the Dune universe, it does feel like filler. But maybe the pearls they find have some sort of significance in later novels. I'm currently reading the second book in this prequel series, House Harkonnen, and it hasn't been brought up again yet, so I'm not sure. This is a 12-issue series, so there's a lot of interesting stuff brewing, and it'll definitely be worth picking it up until the end if they continue to be as faithful as they have been so far. I feel like this issue was the first one where the series hit a bit of a lull. Was it terrible? No, not at all. but this was probably one of my least favorites so far, mainly because it has a lot of mundane sections from the book covered here. No Harkonnens in this issue at all, just pacing-wise, I guess they couldn't fit it in. But yeah, I mean, we start out with Duncan Idaho adapting to his new life on Caladan. I like the look of the Seleucid bulls. They have just a slightly otherworldly look to them, but it's not too over the top with the design. And I like that because Dune isn't like other science fiction where there are aliens everywhere and it's not too fantastical, so this artwork still fits in really well. And like I said in one of the earliest reviews, I love the look of the arena on Caladan where Duke Paulus puts on these bullfighting shows for his people. There is a slightly ominous feeling in the beginning here because you can tell something is not right with the bulls. And if you know anything about this world, it feels like everyone is in danger and could be assassinated at any moment. The Bene Gesserit school on Wallach 9 still has some of the best establishing shots in this book. It just looks so cool, and I love how it's always dark and has almost medieval type of architecture. But it also really looks cinematic and like something Denis Villeneuve would shoot for his Dune movie. This shot comes to mind as well. It's very cinematic and I like the camera placement. Helen Moham has had some terrible things happen to her in this book, but this issue shows that she's just as ruthless as anyone else, maybe even more in some circumstances. And I did like the introduction of baby Jessica, who, if you don't know, is one of the main characters in the original Dune novel. And it was really cool to see the origin of a character I know so well from the original Frank Herbert books. The artwork continues to be really great, and I haven't shouted this out enough, but the colors by Alex Guimarães are so good and dead on for Dune in my opinion. So yeah, I've really been enjoying what he's been doing with this book. A definite highlight is the Duke Paulus bullfight. There's a really great page showing everyone's reaction at the same time, which works really well and builds the tension up in an effective way. Okay, so real quick, I'm gonna do a major spoiler, but you can kind of see it coming in the actual novel version as well. And that's when Duke Paulus dies, and someone was behind it because this particular bull was purposely made to withstand his shields and usual tricks when he fights them, and they hint at it a little in some of the panels. So that's definitely going to ramp up a little bit in the last 4 issues. The part at Kynes sections are getting better and better, and this was the part I was waiting for because he finally learns that the Fremen are capable of riding worms, and there are some epic panels of the Thumper attracting a worm, and then this huge worm shoots out of the sand, and the scale is perfect. There's even a panel that reminded me of some classic Dune art by John Schoner, with a bunch of tiny Fremen next to the worms, and it's just so cool to see something that might have been influenced by that. Some loose ends get tied up with the Vernius family, and the Sardaukar soldiers look great, so I'm really excited to see more of them if they keep going with these adaptations and make a House Harkonnen as well. This issue picks up right after Leto's father, Duke Paulus, was brutally murdered in a bullfight. And I like this somber opening to the comic because you get to see a wide range of Leto's emotions over what has happened and his doubt over leading the people of Caladan at such a young age. I also like this slow unraveling of his mother as a suspect between him and Thufir. I said this in my House Harkonnen book review, but man, Thufir is not great at protecting the Atreides. It seems like almost every book he's in, he lets something slip and someone gets killed or almost killed, and this goes back to the very first Dune book with the hunter-seeker that almost takes out Paul. So I just think it's kind of funny that this keeps happening in the prequels as well. I did think it was a little too clear that his mother had something to do with his father's death, and every line she speaks in this comic makes it more and more obvious. I kind of wish this storyline had a little bit more of a misdirect and mystery to it, instead of being solved right away and Leto sending his mother into exile. That's one of my complaints about the books that these comics are based on. Things happen real fast and get resolved in a rushed way, and something as short as a comic makes this even more evident. I do like the way Leto steps up and shows traits of being a strong leader when he lashes out at his mother and does what he thinks is right regardless of whether he thinks he's ready for this position or not. I'm also a little torn on the Kater Pilru scenes. I like how he's integrated in this book, but for me personally, it's hard to get invested in this character because he has nothing to do with Frank Herbert's books, and that's why I enjoy following Leto's story on Caladan and also the Harkonnens, because it's more interesting to see what the classic characters were up to before the events of the original Dune. There's nothing too compelling to latch onto with Kater other than his relationship with his brother, who in this book is going through the process of becoming a guild navigator, which to me is the most interesting part of this side story. I liked seeing the Spacing Guild central planet, and I know his brother is just starting the process of changing, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the artist's interpretation of a fully formed guild navigator looks like. I like the idea that the guild navigators slowly lose their old memories as they eventually transform into something that doesn't remotely resemble a human being. Over on Kaitane, Shaddam and Fenring's plot to kill Elrond and take over finally comes to fruition, and I really like this very cinematic panel here. There have been great panels like this in almost every issue now, and it really helps create an ominous setting for the book. I don't know if it's an artistic choice, but sometimes it bugs me when the background characters that aren't really that far away from the characters in the foreground don't have faces. I feel like it helps to add detail even in the backgrounds because it comes off as lazy regardless of the intention. This issue also puts into motion a major power play by Shaddam and Fenring to make an artificial spice with the help of the Tleilaxu, so it was cool to see the Tleilaxu's bizarre technology, and there's an air of mystery around everything they do. I like that they have a different skin complexion and don't just look like plain humans, so I enjoy the effort that goes into the character design. I really like this Harkonnen section in this comic and in the book as well because it brings in some lore that was first realized in Heretics of Dune, which is the 5th book in the original series, and the Baron introduces Piter and his men to his chamber that can't be detected by spies, and there's a brutal panel of the dead bodies of every person who helped construct it made as a shrine in his chamber, which just shows how twisted the Baron really is. Piter looks great in this comic, and it was cool to see him in full Mentat mode to come up with a plan to eventually frame Duke Leto Atreides with their new technology, which can cloak a ship and make it completely invisible, which in the Dune books are eventually called no ships. Things are starting to ramp up because the Harkonnens plan to frame Duke Leto at the Imperial ceremony using their new technology. And it's pretty tense leading up to it because you have Romber getting a little too excited and wearing his House Vernius colors, and there's just a real sense of dread to this issue that I like. There are some interesting looking panels in this issue. There's a real scratchy style used by Dev Promenick, which makes Castle Caladan look really ominous and ancient. There's a nice little section with Leto and Duncan, which is really pivotal to their relationship, and sets up Duncan's plans for the next novel, House Harkonnen, where he eventually gets sent off to train as a swordsmaster. The scratchy cross-hatching style continues over in the Harkonnen section on Giedi Prime, and it works even better here. I like how there's a red tint to everything with the coloring on their homeworld, and we get to see them getting ready to use a ship with no-field technology created by a man named Chobin to attack the Tleilaxu and blame it on House Atreides. I really like how these comics and books that they're based on come up with cool scenarios and stories on their own, but also lay the groundwork for a lot of what eventually happens in Herbert's original novels. To me, it all flows together in a really seamless way. One little nitpick I have design-wise is the Atreides ships. I just feel like making them resemble hawks is a little too on the nose and gets a little too fantastical for me and a little too detailed. I guess that's just not what I pictured the ships looking like in the Dune universe, but everyone has their own designs in their head when they read the book, so it is what it is. On the other hand, these Harkonnen ships work a little better during this exciting section on Arrakis with Pardet Kynes and his wife. The action is really well drawn and dynamic, and this part also shows how far he's come with the Fremen and how loyal they are to him. Once again, there are some wonky panels with no face drawn on Shaddam, and maybe that's just an artistic choice like I said last time, but I don't know. I like the design of the Bene Gesserit, and I think this is the first time they're portrayed in broad daylight, but to me it looks very Mobius inspired, which is always good. I was wondering how they would actually portray an invisible ship, and I think they did a good job with it. And it's another cool action sequence that really elevates this story and sets the stakes for the last 2 issues. The issue ends with a nice little scene showing the Bene Gesserit scheming behind the scenes, and once again mentioning things that don't come into play until the first Dune novel. It starts right off with Duke Leto being imprisoned and accused of blowing up a Tleilaxu ship, and I really love the look of these recap panels, and I also really like the look of the Sardaukar soldier masks, and I wish they looked more like this in the movie, but oh well. I also enjoyed the quiet scenes with Thufir and Leto trying to figure out how they can get out of this situation, and the thing I like about this plot at the end of the book, as well as this adaptation, is it shows how complex this world is, and the way alliances and political scheming works, and it's very interesting to see all of these different factions and how they rely on each other while also not trusting each other one bit. So it was nice to see that play out in comic book form as well. The art took a sudden turn with the Shaddam and Fenring sections, and it was really jarring, so I looked back at the credits, and sure enough, this issue has double art duties by both Dev Promanik and Mariano Tabo. And while this new art does fit in well with the aesthetic of this book, I did find the faces and the hands to be a bit wonky, and this one panel here made this book look like a buddy comedy instead of a serious Dune book, so it kind of threw me off and took me out of the story a little bit, to be honest, because it doesn't have the same detail and sense of movement that the original art has. I also keep noticing these no-face panels more and more each issue, and I think this panel is probably the worst example yet. Fenring's face looks like silly putty, so yeah, I don't know what's going on with that, because now it's not even just the background characters, it's everyone. I'd love to hear an explanation of why they do that, if there even is a reason, I'm not sure. So that's a shame, because overall I did like the story, and once again Promanik excels during the action sequences. They're always fluid and fun to look at. One quick thing here, and maybe some hardcore Dune fans can help me out, but I guess Zimia is the capital of Kaitain. I'm not sure if that was mentioned in the House Atreides book, but it has been a little while since I read it, so I'm not sure. Anyway, my favorite part of this is when the Harkonnens show up on Kaitain. I love seeing the flags and their troops showing up. I know it's a small thing, but it reminds me of fan art someone would create, and it was cool to see. I also really like this panel. The background has a really cool effect on it, and the chandelier looks really decadent and like something you'd expect to see on the Emperor's homeworld. This final section also sets the stage for Raban's outbursts, and not to spoil too much, but he's going to become more and more unpredictable and get the Harkonnens in a lot of trouble, so it was cool to see the beginnings of that here. Although I thought the writing and pacing for this last issue were both very solid, I was a little disappointed that the art wasn't as strong. I know that this issue also had a fill-in artist for most of the pages, And I find that kind of odd because you'd think the main artist would like to finish off strong, but I'm not sure what was going on behind the scenes. Maybe he picked up another project and couldn't use all of his time on this issue. Unfortunately, that did kind of ruin the flow of the story and the immersion a little bit, but let's get into this last issue. It starts off basically as a courtroom drama with Duke Leto. Like I've said in previous videos about this comic, some of the designs are a little too over the top for me, and aside from some of the Atreides ships, I also thought that these judge characters' armor, they were just a little too much with the headgear, and overall the backgrounds and the colors looked a little too bright to me for a Dune project. I like this panel here though. It reminded me of a good Cartoon Network show, something like Samurai Jack. I just like the colors and shadows, and I do love the Tleilaxu entrance. They're so dramatic, bringing in a torture device for Leto if he loses the case, and it just shows how vile and vindictive they are. I also still really love their design. It makes them stand out from everyone else in a creepy way. So in an unexpected turn, and if you haven't read the book that this is based on, Shaddam comes in and helps prove Leto's innocence, and he ends up getting set free, but Leto is smart enough to know that this is all for politics, and eventually finds out about Shaddam's true feelings when he asks for the protection of Prince Romber and Kylea. The coronation of Shaddam is really epic looking. It shows you how big Kytane is, and it really helps elevate this comic, even though it started out a little weak in the art department. We get to see Shaddam and Ani Rule get married at the same time. And we also get one last Harkonnen section, basically showing their dismay about what happened with Duke Leto. And there's a great panel of Piter. He looks creepier and creepier each issue, and it's perfect for that character. Fenring finally moves to Arrakis to observe the spice mining, and even though it seems like this is an honor, Fenring knows that it was done to get him out of Shaddam's hair, so he's a little conflicted. And then finally at the end, there's a really nice depiction of Dominic Vernius getting his soldiers ready to go into hiding and plan their revenge on House Carino, so it's a cool little teaser for what's to come. This book ends on Caladan, which I think is fitting to end on a peaceful planet, kind of symbolizing the calm before the storm. So yeah, aside from nitpicks here and there, I thought the creative team did a wonderful job with this series, and you can tell everyone really cares about the Dune universe. So I hope the sales were good enough to warrant a sequel, which is House Harkonnen, the second book in this prequel trilogy. So hopefully they announce that soon, because I'd love to review comic book adaptations of this entire trilogy. So thanks for sticking with me through this whole series. It was a lot of fun for me, and I hope you had fun as well. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content, and thanks again for watching. Hey everyone, it's Ron here with a quick announcement. When I started this channel, I was reading and reviewing the Dune books and other sci-fi related material, and most of you might not know that I'm also a musician. So when I was reading these sci-fi books, I started to get inspired and decided to make my own soundtrack to use for my videos, and now I'm excited to tell you all about the first volume in the Ron Reviews original soundtrack collection. This album includes the first 17 tracks featured on my channel, and it's available now exclusively on Bandcamp. Be sure to check the description of this video for the link to the album. Thanks so much for the support so far. I know I'm just starting out, but I hope you're having as much fun as I am. So check out the original soundtrack Volume 1 on Bandcamp. This music is great if you want something moody and atmospheric to listen to while you're reading some science fiction. I think you're going to love it. Thanks.